So far for this El Nino that we've had, now here in Southern California, we've only had 1 week of rains that were directly attributable to El Nino. Now I was looking at some other materials and it seems like in South Asia, their monsoon season they're getting less rainfall than usual, and parts of Southeast Asia are experiencing droughts.
Right. So you can kind of think of it as kind of a tiered system in terms of impacts with El Nino. The closer you are to the tropical Pacific, the more likely you're going to see a pretty standard impact. The further you are away in the mid-latitudes where we live, you kind of have to rely on a cascade of events to kind of see those impacts. So you're right. In Southeast Asia, it's been very dry. We've seen a good amount of forest fires and wildfires develop over that area. A lot of pollution from that, reducing visibility across a lot of major cities in that region. Meanwhile, Australia actually usually tends to see certain conditions as well, but they've actually not seen as much impact that they would normally expect to see during El Nino because the waters around Australia are abnormally warm, which is kind of counteracting some of the impacts from El Nino. But you're right. In Southern California, you've basically over the last 30 days had average rainfall, which is good considering how dry it's been over the last 4 years. But certainly when you hear El Nino, when you think about California, you think, oh, that means a lot of rainfall for Southern California. We're still early in the season. We still have until really March. I would say January, February, March is really a prime time to see a lot of rainfall. So it's still early. There's still a chance that we could see a good amount of rainfall. But, it shows you how, while we have this big event happening in the Pacific Ocean, weather still goes on in the United States. And there are other things that could necessarily impact where that rain ends up being. And right now, it seems like all of that rain has been pointing more towards Northern California and not so much Southern California so far.
And this is where it gets interesting to me, because when I look at 97, 98, which, I was here in LA at that point, and I don't really remember being inconvenienced by weather at that time, but certainly the records show that we got an extraordinary amount of rain. And what's interesting to me is if this one turns out to be like that, then yes, all of the big rain is ahead of us in February and March.
Right. I mean, the most recent seasonal forecast that we issued at the Climate Prediction Center basically says that there's a decent tilt in the odds towards it still being a very wet, or at least wetter than average, January through March. That's still expected to happen. So you could still potentially see a good amount of rainfall falling, and just climatologically, the way we normally see things with El Nino, that's generally the case. Of course, just because it happens in the past doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen in the future, which is why there's always a risk that it won't. But there still is a tilt in those odds towards it being wetter than average over the next 3 months. So just because we haven't seen as much as you expected per se so far doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the season won't be wet. We haven't gotten to that part yet, and we'll have to play that more closer to when we actually see those storms kind of moving on shore, thanks to that extended jet stream, thanks to El Nino. But there's still plenty of time for rainfall for California and Southern California.